Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hangouts with James Fee. This is episode 4, our geospatial future. My name is James Fee. I work for OSGeo, and I'm joined today with two guests, Madeline Steele in, I guess, sunny Portland, Oregon. Hi, Madeline.
Hello.
And Peter Batty from, I guess, sunny Denver, Colorado, continuing our guests from Colorado that we are never going to stop, apparently. Hello, Peter.
Hey, James. Yeah, well, Colorado is the center of the geospatial universe. You know that.
So they tell us, right?
Yeah.
Nobody loves Colorado more than Coloradians.
Indeed, and I'm a Coloradian, as you can tell.
So, Madeline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Madeline. I work at OSGeo, and I'm here to track comments and ask these guys questions that'll get them back on track when they get too far out into the weeds. So,
Great. And don't forget, this week we have a new website, weogeo.com/video, that if you go there and you click on Peter Batty's face, specifically his nose, you will get to a place where we're going to be tracking comments. So this should be a little bit easier than it was before with Google and their wacky tracking comments thing.
You say I have a large nose to click on, James.
Well, you know, it's some of us have bigger noses than others. I'll have to share with people. There's a picture of Dave Bowman and me having beers at the Ezra UC, and it's one of those things where the perspective of the photo causes it to make it look like my head is 4 times larger than Dave's, and he's this little itty bitty guy sitting next to my big head. So and there's probably lots of jokes about that as well. So,
Indeed.
So Peter, why don't you introduce yourself to those who don't know who you are?
Sure, yeah. So I've worked in the geospatial industry forever. I guess I started in 1986, before some of these neo-geographers were born. And along the way, I've been CTO of 2 of the largest 3 traditional GIS companies, I guess, depending on whose survey you believe, that's Small World and Intergraph. And then the last few years, I've been working mainly on projects more with the sort of new generation and web mapping systems like Google and so on, and then quite a lot with open source geospatial. So, and I guess I've mainly worked in the utilities and telecoms and that kind of area. So that's my main background in terms of applications.
Great. So right now you're working for Ubisense. I mean, what do they do?
Yeah. So Ubisense is there's really 2 halves to the company. So one half is what we call RTLS, or real-time location systems, kind of like indoor GPS, if you like. So we put sensors and track things pretty accurately, and that might be an interesting thing to chat about a little bit. And then the other half is the geospatial division, and we work primarily with Small World customers. And I guess not everybody may be familiar with Small World these days, but they're still the largest GIS company in utilities and telecoms, according to most analysts, though a lot of folks outside that niche haven't heard of them. So we do kind of consulting services and implementation work there. And then more specifically, what I'm working on is building applications based on open source and Google Maps to kind of integrate with Small World and really kind of distribute the spatial data more through the enterprise, give them systems that are a lot easier to use, that kind of thing. So those are kind of the 2 halves of Ubisense. And we went public last summer, and our share price is still above where it started, so we're doing better than Facebook in that respect.
Right. Oh well. So we're going to talk about the future of GIS, and I just thought it would be interesting to go back on my blog and go back 5 years and see what we were talking about basically today 5 years ago, and figure out, is it some sort of silly thing that we were doing and we didn't know any better. And actually this week 5 years ago I was complaining about Google Map Maker.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny that it seems like it's hard to believe that's 5 years old, that the idea of Google open sourcing, because it's totally not open source, but allowing you to edit their maps. How do you think that whole crowdsourcing, data has gone?
Well, overall, I think it's had a huge impact. I think you're seeing OpenStreetMap-based data pop up in more and more maps, or more and more applications. And I think it's there's still certain questions about some aspects of it, but overall, as a general principle, I don't think there's any doubt that crowdsourcing, both active and passive crowdsourcing, has a big role in maintaining data going forward. Whether or not OpenStreetMap ends up being the big crowdsourcing thing in a few years, I think there's a question of whether the OpenStreetMap will be it or whether something else might come along that's similar. But I definitely think that crowdsourcing is a big piece of the data maintenance puzzle and here to stay, really.
Peter, could you clarify the difference between active and passive crowdsourcing for us?
Yeah, sure. So what I mean by that, active crowdsourcing, at least the terms I use, and I think various folks do, is something like OpenStreetMap, where you have to go and use an application and actually, do something to enter data. By passive crowdsourcing, I mean stuff like tracking people's smartphones, and Apple mentioned in the middle of this whole location gate saga last year, one thing in the fine print, which I was surprised more people didn't make a fuss about, is that Apple is tracking the location of every iPhone, and there's no anonymously, and there's no way to turn that off. So that gives you a huge amount of data about location of roads and traffic speed and that kind of thing. And so it's useful both for getting information like traffic flow, obviously in real time or historically, but also for updating maps. If you see lots of phones moving along somewhere at 30 miles an hour and you don't have a street in your database, you can be pretty sure there's something wrong there. So I think both of those things have a pretty strong role to play going forward. And everybody's kind of adopting that to some extent. Not just OpenStreetMap, but like James said, Google and Apple is using it, and TomTom, the traditional geospatial navigation vendors. So
it's interesting. As you were talking, I was just thinking, there's a lot of crowdsourced maps that I contribute to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and some of them are better than others, right?
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be any movement towards a single map, or you just think there's so much power in Google, Apple, Microsoft, etc., owning their version of the map that that'll never happen?
Yeah, I kind of think it's hard to see how you'd really get to a single map. I think there's a number of different initiatives going on. For one reason or another, I think, depending on who you listen to, Google sort of had some interaction with OpenStreetMap and decided to go in their own direction again. And I suspect that's unlikely to reconverge. And now Apple's in the mix, and who knows what they will do. And then people just have different aims for it. I think one of the interesting things about OpenStreetMap is people who are involved have quite different aims. There's some people who really just enjoy it because they like mapping their local area, and they don't really care about having a global complete database that will compete with Google. And so, and there are some people involved who are more concerned about that. But there's this pretty diverse section of interests in OpenStreetMap. And I think OpenStreetMap is really very good on the mapping front now. Where they're weaker is on sort of routing and then address searching, in particular address searching probably. And that's been a personal frustration of mine. I think, like they loaded all the Tiger data in the US that had address ranges on it, and that all got thrown away, and could have been a very useful basis. But again, people have different views on what's important for it, so it's hard to get a focus on that, and I haven't had time to get agitated about it. But I think that's the big thing that we need in a free crowdsourced thing that's not there in OpenStreetMap today is good address searching, though it is improving. But
yeah, there was it Steve Coase had that app that he created for Microsoft where you put a point on top of the roofs. Remember that, the rooftop geocoding? And I did that for a little bit, and quickly you realize that's a lot of work.
Yeah, well, and that's been one thing where I think, to me, the address range kind of thing is perfectly, that's useful for 90% of the applications you want, to navigate to somewhere, and if you're slightly down the street, it doesn't really matter. Whereas for one reason or another, there seems to have been quite a bit of focus in OpenStreetMap of saying, well, let's do every individual property, and that's great, but you could get 90% of the functionality you want with 10% of the effort by something more focused on address ranges, I think. So, anyway, yeah, we'll see where that goes. But I mean, I'm sure that we are going to have open crowdsourced address databases one way or another, whether it's through OpenStreetMap or through something else. Another angle on that is folks like Foursquare and whatnot. There's been a reasonable bit of talk about getting points of interest databases that are open and shareable, and haven't seen anything specific on that recently. I don't know if you have, but
No.
that just seems like a logical thing that's going to happen, because there's no major competitive advantage in that even today, and I don't think there will be in the future, really. So I'm pretty sure one way or another we'll get that kind of points of interest as a free and open crowdsourced thing.
Yeah, it's I think the key, we're talking about the future, and Andrew Turner wrote a blog post this morning about open, and we've mentioned open a lot here in the last 5 minutes. There's really two opens, right? There's open data, and then there's open source software. Clearly, open generically is going to be important in the future of GIS, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's definitely been a big move to open data, and there's some more complicated aspects to that, which I've talked about before, in terms of how do you fund national mapping agencies and that kind of thing. That's maybe a side conversation, but then, I do think open source is really important. These days, I'm on the board of OSGeo, the Open Source Geospatial Foundation, which is kind of an umbrella organization that supports a lot of open source projects. And in the work that I'm doing these days, I use a lot of open source. And, there's really a lot of incredibly good software out there in the open source world. And I only really got involved in that, 5 years ago, but I've been really impressed with it. And increasingly, more and more, I use open source in my projects, not because I have any particular, leaning inherently towards open source or closed source, but just when I evaluate, the functionality and the cost and all that kind of stuff, I end up with open source being, the thing to choose. And in fact, perhaps one of the biggest reasons as well now is sort of predictability going forward. With a lot of these web mapping things, and even with Google, which we use a lot, there's still kind of some uncertainty in my mind that, mapping is such a small thing in the overall spectrum of what Google does. Even though Google Maps is pretty big, will somebody in Google just decide, hey, we pull support for the enterprise mapping licenses or the API or whatever, or will we change the terms significantly? And they have had a couple of changes of terms. Whereas with open source, it's much more predictable. That that's not going to happen in general, and even if something kind of does happen, you still have access to the source, and so you can kind of maintain things. So that's actually been a pretty big factor for me in choosing open source. So I don't know. You use quite a bit of open source stuff as well, right?
Yeah, we're other than FME, which we use for most of our transformations, most of our stack is open source, and gives you a little bit of the freedom and, as you said, the certainty of being able to pick and choose what you want to put in, rather than just saying, here's this big ArcObjects model of thousands of things, and whether you need them or not, they're going to come along for the ride.
Yeah.
And they bloat your system up. And I think even Esri acknowledges that reality just isn't possible these days, that you need these smaller, lighter weight libraries and just be able to pull out just what you need. So,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we'll see that with, the GeoIQ guys joining Esri. Maybe they will accelerate some of that growth in Esri's ecosystem.
Yeah.
But clearly, there's been a lot of blog posts from Esri this summer about open data, open source. I think it's pretty safe. I think we can both agree that the next 5 years, open is probably going to be the reality of GIS.
Yeah, but I mean, and open's been a buzzword for 10, 15 years, right? I mean, at Small World, we were always beaten on having, in quotes, a proprietary database. And, I think all vendors have always paid lip service to open, and I think, Esri can talk about how open source is important to them, but I still don't see them really getting significantly into open source. I mean, I think there's areas where they use open source. I mean, it'll be interesting to see, but even GeoIQ wasn't open source, right? So it would be a really fundamental change in business model that is just very hard for any established software company to say, hey, we're going to really go open source. So, I don't think that it's likely we'd see Esri adopting open source in any major way, open sourcing ArcGIS or the web products or whatever.
So you guys think there's going to be more open source, but that it will still be sort of not the dominant part of the market, or?
Well, I would hope, I mean, one of the things that I think is exciting right now is I think we are going to get a lot more diversity in the market, over the next 5 years or whatever. Esri clearly dominates some parts of the market very heavily. In other areas like utilities, so it's a bit more balanced. I mean, Small World and Intergraph still have quite a strong presence, even though in the broader world people don't hear so much about them. But we are starting to see quite a lot of government adoption of open source, and I think in general, in that broader market, open source is probably emerging as kind of the major alternative to Esri. At the recent FOSS4G conferences, both the one in Denver and then the one which was last year, and the one in DC this year, Mike Byrne from the FCC gave some really great talks on his thoughts about using open source and open data. And so, they're a large government agency that's really adopting open source, and I think, I think we'd like to see that more and see Esri's dominance a bit less, which I think is a good thing to have more competition.
So, Peter, I checked out your recent blog on the geospatial tech in the next 5 to 10 years, and one of the things you talked about quite a bit was advances in indoor positioning, which I guess you guys do a lot of at Ubisense. Is that right?
Yeah, so like I mentioned briefly, that's what we're working on, and one half of the business there is this indoor positioning. And it's really an interesting area, because to me it's like, when you first think about it, you wouldn't think it's necessarily that difficult, right? We can track people all around the world with GPS, but there still aren't systems that can really reliably track you indoors, on a broad scale. And the primary reason why it's difficult is what people call a multipath problem. So basically that whatever kind of signal you use, whatever kind of sensing signal, you tend to get reflections off the walls and floors and ceilings. And then there's lots of things indoors that will block it, furniture or people. And so quite often you might get a reflected signal that's stronger than the direct signal. So suddenly it's saying, oh, you're over here and not where you think you are. And it's kind of been a field where there's been a lot of people have overpromised. There was a lot of hype about Wi-Fi positioning, and realistically, you might get, in good cases, you can maybe get 10 feet. In bad cases, it might be 20 or 30 feet. It's certainly not accurate enough to reliably position you within a given room, say. And so it depends what you want to do. If you just want a rough area of a building, Wi-Fi might be workable, but so in general, it's kind of difficult. But we use a technology called ultrawideband, which is a sort of specialized wireless network technology that has some properties that are good for this. It has a very short pulse. And we install sensors around a building, then track little tags. Actually, I brought a prop here. This is a Ubisense tag, this sort of track. So, it's like 1/2 inch thick and 1 inch square. And so you can put that on people or on objects. And
is that a suppository?
No. Look, it's just a little square.
All right. Well, you said put on people. I didn't know if you.
Yeah. Well, usually as a wristband.
All right.
We do have a version you can hang around your neck as well. It's like an ID badge. So. Though it's interesting, one of the problems with people is they absorb electromagnetic radiation pretty effectively. They're mainly water. So if you kind of hang it on your chest here, it really doesn't go out the back of you very well. So being on the wrist is quite good.
So I was wondering, with indoor positioning, I could see how it would be useful in manufacturing situations or like law enforcement, sort of high stakes places. But is there any real benefit to an average person going about their daily activities, or?
Yeah, I think, like you say, today a lot of the applications are in more constrained environments. Certainly the stuff we're doing at Ubisense, we're focused on manufacturing facilities, military and fire training, and like inside bus depots and things like that, where they all park in long lines. But, I think the same kind of applications you have with any location-based services of, navigation or finding restaurants near you or those kind of things. If you're inside a shopping mall or in a subway station or those kind of things, there's a number of areas where those kind of location-based services really don't work so well. And obviously you want them, by and large, to work in a finer-grained way, in a more accurate way in those sort of situations too. But so, and then, going around museums, that kind of thing, and having information that's automatically based on where you currently are. And obviously there's kind of lower tech solutions for some of those things. A lot of museums have these audio tours where you press a button in, press a number in when you reach a certain point, but you could automate that kind of thing more. So.
Oh, well, we have a question from our viewers. Rock on Cali says, if government folks aren't ready to make the full switch, but we perhaps want to be supportive of open movements, what should we do?
I guess, James might have comments too, but one thing I would certainly suggest looking at is, I think an area where open source products are particularly strong against closed source products is for web mapping. And so certainly I think even if you're doing more heavyweight applications and maintenance of your data using ArcGIS and so on, I think it's worth looking at open source solutions for web mapping is kind of a good way to start, where you're not having to switch everything out. And one particular advantage of free software in that environment is, if you want to scale up to support larger numbers of users with traditional closed source software vendors, there's usually some additional license fee every time you fire up an extra server. But if you can just fire up extra servers on Amazon or whatever and not pay any extra fees, that's a big factor for me. Though I was kind of interesting that at both the last couple of FOSS4G conferences, there have been people who are very heavily into open source who say cost really isn't a primary factor for them. The fact that it's free is sort of incidental, that it's other factors about the quality of the software and how quickly it develops and how flexible it is, which was kind of interesting. And I agree with all those things, but I also think the free is important too. I wouldn't understate that bit. I don't know, James, do you have any thoughts?
For me, probably the easiest way for somebody stuck in a proprietary world to get involved with open source is through scripting with Python. A lot of the proprietary GIS packages use Python as their scripting engine, and so you could start bringing in a lot of these analytical Python tools, which are really awesome. And as you were getting into, as Peter sort of talked a little bit about, it's not so much that these Python things are free, but they are really good at specifics of what they do. So you can pull in, R, for example, to do statistical analysis rather than using, your proprietary engines analysis tools. Do that work and still have it output to, a file geodatabase if you wished. Those are really cool tools and easy to get started with. And, what's great about them is you can learn in an Esri environment, gain those skills, and then take them on the road to almost anywhere.
Yeah.
So
I guess one other thing I would mention more specifically on geospatial open source tools is a couple of good ways of just trying it out easily. One is that there's a DVD called OSGeo Live. If you Google for OSGeo Live, you can download a sort of DVD image that you can install, and that has a whole bunch, I think it's 19 or 20 different open source software packages on with some sample data and that kind of thing. So that's a good way of having a little play around. And then another thing on a similar vein is that there's a company called OpenGeo, which people often get confused with OSGeo, but OpenGeo works with a sort of subset of the same products, but they're focused on providing commercial support for that and helping people implement them. But they have a package set of sort of like 4 major products: PostGIS and GeoServer and OpenLayers are some of the main bits. And so they have sort of packaged installations that you can just download and install, and then you have, again, a sort of running system. Because one of the things that's a bit of a hurdle on some of the open source is just often the installation isn't as packaged as some of the other things. But those are 2 good packaged solutions, the OpenGeo community solution or the OSGeo Live thing, if you want to just sort of spend a few hours and dabble around with this software and understand a bit more about what it can do.
Yeah, cool. Peter, people always ask me this one question. James, I'm going to college. I want to do GIS when I grow up. What should I do? They always ask me that question. And I'm just curious, when someone asks you that question, what do you tell them? I mean, in 5 years, I'm going to graduate. I want to be, worth something to somebody. What can I do?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, by and large, in the kind of stuff I do, we really don't recruit people with GIS degrees. We tend to much more recruit programmers, and that's a little influenced by what we're doing. I mean, we're kind of developing geospatial software, and so it does kind of depend on what you want to do. I think one piece of advice I increasingly give to people, even if you are doing GIS, is to try and get some specific skills in another area too. I think more and more, just basically knowing quote GIS and nothing else, is going to be less valuable as the tools become much simpler, and you don't need a GIS specialist to go and produce a reasonably nice looking plot or whatever. It's just something that a typical end user can do. Whereas if you know something about environmental planning or electrical engineering or whatever the domain is, as well as something about geospatial, then you can really kind of apply the two. So I think diversifying into an area where you're interested in applying it and getting some skills in that sort of business area, I think is probably a good piece of advice. Or if you're more interested in the development side, really learning web programming, and if you're more interested in the technical side, I'd say become a good programmer, and the geospatial stuff is easy to pick up. It's a lot. In general, our experience has been that's true versus taking somebody with a GIS degree and trying to teach them programming. But that's influenced, say, by the areas that I kind of work in.
Yeah,
what do you tell people?
Well, I tell, what, Madeline doesn't know this, but you and I remember they used to have people who were typists. They used to have a typing pool in companies, and nobody ever typed anything themselves. They would write it out on a piece of paper and then go down the hallway and hand it to a typist, and they would type away. And it used to be a job, and some of these people got paid a lot of money to do it. And GIS, I think, it's not an exact parallel, but in a way it is that typing eventually became so easy to the point that everybody could pack away at Office and create something. GIS, generically is getting easy enough that anybody can just take a device such as an iPhone and run some spatial analysis that 5 years ago you paid a guy a lot of money to do.
Yeah.
So part of what I always say to people is figure out what you enjoy doing, because if you don't enjoy what you're doing, you're going to be miserable, period. And then sort of specialize in that field. Just don't say I'm going to run buffers on pipelines in Texas, because that's easy enough that anybody can do that. So, but if you're going to be in the energy business, there's a whole lot of stuff going in as far as finding oil, gas, shale, all that stuff that you can be really good at and have a job for years. And
I think it's so interesting because I've heard the same message from pretty much every expert I've talked to about this, which is that you shouldn't just study GIS. That's not enough. It's just a tool. You need to have an education in something more substantive. But yet there are more and more universities that are adding GIS certificate programs. So, and there's more students like in Portland studying GIS than probably there ever have been. So I feel like there's sort of a mismatch between what the schools are providing and what the experts are saying.
What is an MBA, right? I mean, really, an MBA is something you add on top of something else that you did. It's sort of like you get to a point and then you say, I need an MBA for whatever reason. GIS in a way is sort of the same thing. You're doing something and then it's like, oh shoot, here's all this great technology that I can do. Let me just add it on, and lo and behold, you can start using geospatial analysis in whatever you do.
I think for colleges to teach modules or whatever courses in GIS, but to have them in other programs as well, is a really useful thing. I guess one other thing I would say is, again, obviously Esri I think is very dominant in the educational space, and like we talked about, I think demand for open source and people with modern web mapping skills is going to grow a lot. So I would also encourage people to think about, if you're looking at learning technical platforms, being more diverse there and looking at some of the open source platforms, looking at doing things with Google Maps or Bing Maps, those kind of things too.
Yeah, cool. Well, Peter, I guess we're just about out of time. It's funny how quick these half an hour things go. We'll have to do this again. Maybe next time something crazy happens, you and I can get on and talk about it.
Sure, yeah, that would be fun. Well, thanks for having me on. And, let's do it again.
Yeah, and next week we have a new guest. It will not be Brian Timoney, because we are getting out of Denver. We're going to have Sean Gorman. Let me get the scale here, so he's the
there we
same
go.
size
Well,
as
actually, Sean is really a Coloradan. I don't know if you knew that. His parents live here, so he's just a kind of Coloradan who's stuck on the East Coast temporarily, I think. So that's okay.
Don't we all have little Sean Gorman popsicles? He's so easy to cut out.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have one handy, James.
Do you have this guy?
No, I'm afraid I'm lacking in cutouts.
So y'all know that I have, but Andrew's not going to be on. So we're going to put Andrew away. We'll pull him out later. It's going to be Sean Gorman. We're going to talk hopefully about his wild ride.
Yeah,
through open data, open sharing, and everything else, and maybe he can even talk about Esri, but who knows? We'll find out if he is able to do that. So next week, same time, same place, and if someone asked me yesterday if they could suggest people to be on this, yes, please go ahead and email me or tweet it to me or Facebook me or MySpace me. Actually, I'm not on MySpace. But let me know, and we can see about getting them on. So thanks a lot, Peter. And Madeline, you got anything to add?
No, just thanks everyone for watching, and see you next week.
Bye, guys.
Great.
I'm going to row a boat.